Flood disasters have become increasingly common in recent years all over the world, together with increasing drought conditions and unseasonal freezing. The freezing is disastrous for agriculture. It destroys fruit crops in extreme cases in areas that used to be totally safe. We have seen greenhouses collapse under snow loads. We have seen agricultural crops decimated by frost snaps as far south as Mexico. We have even seen snowfall in the Sahara recently. We have seen large areas devastated by increasing drought conditions, as in the case of California. And we have seen once mighty rivers that had filled great reservoirs almost dry up. We now see their penstocks that once powered large volumes of electric energy production sitting high and dry near the minimal intake level. The Colorado River system is facing an unprecedented water supply crisis. The two main Colorado River reservoirs, Lake Powell behind the Grand Canyon Dam and Lake Mead behind the Hoover Dam, have been hovering around the half-full mark for the past decade, with the power production at around the half-capacity mark. Studies have concluded that the water-rich era on the Colorado River is history, so that the lakes are unlikely to both ever fill up again, and might even go dry altogether within a decade, with immense consequences, because the vast Colorado River supplies water to 40 million people, and irrigation for 4.5 million acres of agricultural land. The water crisis is so severe that the shutdown and demolition of the Grand Canyon Dam is being debated. While this is happening, increasing flooding events occur elsewhere. In Europe, for example, endless rain and flooding devastated vegetable cultivation to the point that rationing began, and unseasonal soil saturation dangerously delayed sowing for new crops. We see now ever more areas inundated with flooding that historically have been safe from flooding. Flash floods have been happening even amidst long extended droughts, in some cases on a near-continental scale, extending from Texas all the way to Canada. The latest major event on the train of unprecedented weather conditions was the flooding in central California of Lake Oroville, the second largest reservoir in California. The lake collects the runoff from a 10,200 square kilometer catchment basin. Lake Oroville has a Mediterranean-type climate with hot, dry summers and cold, wet winters, located near a semi-permanent high-pressure area of the Pacific Ocean. In February 2017, this entire region was suddenly flooded. The normally water-starved lake suddenly rose 20 feet in 6 days as storms kept rolling in. 9 smaller primary reservoirs feed into the Lake Oroville. All were filled to the brim. As the lake filled, the spillway was taxed to the limits to prevent an overflow. In the process, the spillway began to fail. A large hole developed. As the lake level increased further, 4 days later, the lake overflowed at its 1,500-foot emergency spillway, a 30-foot high concrete wall. The overflowing eroded the ground below the wall. That prompted the evacuation of 190,000 people. Repairs were made to its base after the lake was torn down with the damaged main spillway, enough for the overflow of the lake to stop. But with another volley of rainfall on the way, who can predict the result? 10 inches of rain over a catchment area of 10,000 square kilometers adds up to a lot of water. The fact that the system of dams exists at all has saved the entire downstream area from immense flooding, as it has for the last 50 years since the dam was built, and it did so again. Thanks to the emergency spillway system that very few dams have, that had never been needed since the dam was built, the dam had remained intact in spite of the worst flooding ever in that region. And thanks to the 9 upstream reservoirs, the water level in the lake behind the dam could be lowered by more than 50 feet so that repairs could be made to the damaged emergency spillway in case it should be needed again. What had caused this near-catastrophic flooding event that, according to historic data, should not have occurred was a mere fringe effect of the now changing global climate dynamics that invariably reflects the now fast-changing solar dynamics. This renders the flooding a fringe effect of the transition to the next ice age that is already in progress. These real dynamics, however, are ignored as if they were but a dream. Instead, man-made climate change is being blamed for the increasing flooding as an excuse. The actual immediate cause for the flooding in Northern California had 2 factors standing behind it. One was evidently the immensely strong flow of the northern jet stream that is strengthened by the cooling of the earth. The jet stream, at the time of the disaster, had dipped deep into the tropics, past the Hawaiian Islands, almost to the 15 degrees latitude. The circulation system that drives the jet streams deposits cold air from the northern latitudes deep into the south and pulls moist, warm air northward on a return path. In mid-February 2017, the jet stream system flowed right across the west coast on a broad front that extended from Canada all the way to Mexico, with Northern California being located at the center of this massive global circulation system. While the jet stream phenomenon is normal, and the massive northern jet stream occurs every winter, its extremely deep extent into the tropics is not historically common. It is an effect of the increasing cooling of the Earth, whereby its southward penetration has increased in recent years. The jet stream itself, however, is not the main cause for the flooding. The main factor for the flooding was evidently the increasing volume of solar cosmic ray flux that has an enormous effect on water vapor nucleation that causes clouds to form and to rain out. The evidence that this was the main contributing factor in the California flooding event is visible on the Sun. In the time frame of the flooding, a large weakening had occurred in the corona around the Sun, termed a corona hole. Such weak spots on the corona typically enable larger volumes of cosmic ray flux to be emitted from the Sun. In this particular case, the weak area in the corona occurred near the equator of the Sun and was pointed directly towards the Earth. The equatorial alignment is critical in this case, as it brings it into line with the planetary ecliptic where the Earth orbits. This means that the coronal hole had opened up right in the direction of the Earth, so that the Earth would have received a significantly larger volume of cosmic ray flux flowing through the coronal hole than is normally received. This effect, combined with the strong onflow of moisture from the tropics, created the conditions for the flooding. Cosmic ray flux has a major impact on cloud formation. Cosmic rays are not rays in the standard sense like rays of light. Cosmic rays are single events of fast-moving electrically charged particles, primarily protons and electrons. As the particles flow through the atmosphere, an electric charge by electromagnetic action. They ionize the atmosphere. They create a disturbance in the normal electric balance. The ionization aids cloud nucleation. It can have a dramatic effect, especially when the natural atmospheric conditions that are conducive to the nucleation are also present. That cosmic ray ionization has an enormous influence on the cloud nucleation has been experimentally demonstrated at the European CERN laboratory with the cloud experiment. In the experiment, a large chamber of water vapor was subjected to the normal conditions that cause cloud nucleation, and the effect was measured. Then, artificial cosmic rays were injected into the chamber from a particle accelerator. At the moment when the artificial cosmic rays were added, the measured nucleation increased sharply. The measurements went straight up and off the chart. In this context, the CERN lab proved in principle that a flooding event in Northern California was greatly enhanced by the larger volume of cosmic ray flux from the Sun that flowed through the Earth-aligned coronal hole. Larger volumes of cosmic ray flux cause stronger cloud formation. Increased cloudiness by the white tops of the clouds reflects more solar radiation back into space, thereby cooling the Earth. The increased cloud nucleation also causes the clouds to rain out faster, whereby the water transport distance becomes reduced, producing drought conditions in many areas. The more distant areas on the cloud flow path, especially the areas far inland and behind mountains, become drought-stricken thereby. Inversely, areas with a topology that favors natural rainout become more heavily flooded by the increased cosmic ray ionization. Cloud nucleation is a combination of numerous factors. The prime factor are water vapor density and air temperature. Water molecules have a slightly electric dipole characteristic, which enables them to latch onto each other. This happens more readily at lower temperatures, where the molecules are less agitated. Now, when cosmic ionization becomes an additional factor, so that atomic elements in the atmosphere become ionized, which means that they become electrically charged. The charged particles become 100 times more effective in attracting water vapor molecules that have an electric dipole quality. By this effect, a large sudden influx in cosmic rays can cause large-scale flooding. The resulting sudden change happens because the cosmic electric interference radically alters the natural balance. The cosmic ray effect gives the natural cloud nucleation a tremendous boost, and this boosting can take place without warning. It is generally believed that a large inflow of clouds is required for strong rainfalls to happen. While this is normally the case, it is not always required. Cosmic ray ionization can turn a blue sky into dark clouds and cause floods within hours. This is so because the atmosphere is naturally loaded with water. Water vapor typically makes up 1% of the atmosphere, with the troposphere extending upwards to roughly 10,000 feet, where all the weather is created. The 1% density amounts to 100 feet of water. Thus, when one is looking at a clear sky, one looks at 100 feet of water in the air, which is typically invisible except in cases where the nucleation has taken place in the form of fog. The 1% density is a rough estimate. It varies with local conditions and elevations, but whatever the effective density may be at a specific place, there is a lot of water floating in the atmosphere. It doesn't take much of an incentive under such conditions for cosmic ray ionization to cause 5 inches of extra rainfall or even a foot of rain to be suddenly happening out of the blue. Cosmic ray ionization can have this kind of dramatic effect. The question arises here, is the cosmic ray effect increasing? Is the cosmic ray density increasing as evidence suggests? Was the California flooding at the Orville watershed a freak anomaly, or was it a part of an increasing trend? This is an important question, because the answer is that the flooding event resulted from a trend that is fast increasing in magnitude. This means that we haven't seen anything yet. Measurements conducted in space in orbits around the Sun tells us that our Sun is in a free-fall type weakening phase towards a little ice age in the 2030s and further towards the next full ice age thereafter in potentially the 2050s. The dramatic weakening of the Sun as a long-term trend was first measured by NASA's and ESO's Ulysses spacecraft over a span of 10 years between its first and last orbit. The spacecraft had measured a 30% diminishment of the solar wind pressure and a 20% increase in cosmic ray flux over its 10-year period of observing the Sun, ending in 2008. These are enormous figures for a 10-year time frame, which is minuscule on the cosmic timescale. While the weakening solar wind does not affect the climate directly, to a large degree, but is merely an indicator of the weakening sun. The measured increased cosmic ray flux, however, has an enormous effect. The diminishing of the sun appears to have started in 1998, according to on-the-ground average temperature measurements measured in southern Siberia by the Solar Terrestrial Institute of Irkutsk. The measurements were progressively lower. That's the trend that we also saw reported from space. The Great California Drought began roughly 10 years after the sun began to diminish. The solar downtrend is also reflected in diminishing sunspot cycles. We are now 19 years down the slope of the diminishing sun. The worldwide drought conditions have increased, and flooding conditions and colder temperatures in many parts of the world have likewise increased, with increasing warming occurring in the polar regions. The point is that we have seen tremendous changes even in the few years since 1910, when the Great California Drought began, and drought conditions around the world began to increase. And the related point is that all this is just the beginning of an increasingly worsening trend that will extend for 30 more years, after which it gets really bad. It gets really bad when the full ice age begins, that will likely begin in the 2050s. From this point on, we will be operating on a completely different climate scale. I have encircled the Ice Age startup of the last Ice Age and have projected it forward into our time as an illustration of what we are getting into, that we need to prepare ourselves for. Note that the little Ice Age is barely noticeable on the larger scale, though it had catastrophic consequences on agriculture in many areas across Europe, especially in the northern regions, where up to 30% of the population perished by starvation. All of that will pale in comparison with what is to come. This is what I mean with it getting really bad. We really don't know what full glaciation conditions are like when the solar energy radiation diminishes by potentially 70%. Conditions may be encountered that seem unimaginable today. Vast areas outside the tropics will likely become uninhabitable, with the cold and ice conditions reaching deep into today's temperate zone, where many of the great cities are located, that thereby become uninhabitable. The 30 years trend that is now in progress towards the phase shift to the full Ice Age will take us deep into a little Ice Age along the way. The little Ice Age will give us a minuscule foretaste of what is to come. But why should we wait that long? We have seen already huge effects in the current time in terms of drought, flooding and freezing conditions. Farther down along the line of this trend towards the little Ice Age stage, we will see sunspots no longer occurring, potentially after the 2020s or sooner. In the 2030s, the solar wind will likely stop, with the sun's surface temperature becoming colder thereafter, gradually, until a threshold is crossed past which the primer fields collapse that keep the sun in its current high-powered mode. That's the trend we are on. We will likely see a large increase in solar cosmic ray flux occurring along the way, resulting in ever more cloudiness on Earth, with expanding droughts, flooding, and deep cold snaps in ever more places, with unpredictable catastrophic effects on agriculture and all aspects of human living, and environmental effects that are already disturbing, such as the ongoing polar warming. In other words, we haven't seen anything yet that we need to get ready for. We will likely see the Arctic warming revving up, that we already see a bit of, as the result of the ongoing global cooling. The currently ongoing Arctic warming is an effect of the Earth getting colder. This is not a paradox. It is caused by the global air circulation system that the jet streams are a part of, which are driven in part by the global circulation system. The circulation system draws warm air from the subtropical jets at roughly the 30 degrees latitude and transports it northward through the Ferrel cell and the polar cell. The jet stream system is a global air circulation system that is affected by the spinning of the Earth and its curvature, which by its effects creates 3 distinct air circulation cells. The cells are also affected by the prevailing temperature differences. Cold air masses in the high-latitude regions are forced towards the tropics by the centrifugal force of the spinning of the Earth. The recirculation pulls warm air masses back into the polar regions. The resulting typical circulation system in the north has been termed the polar mobile anticyclone. This means that the colder the Earth gets, the stronger the circulation becomes, and the larger the volume of warm air becomes that is drawn into the polar regions. The process isn't dangerous. It typically affects mostly the low-lying areas, such as ice shelves and the edges of the Greenland ice sheet. The thinning polar ice is an effect of the cooling of the Earth, and is nothing to be alarmed about, except for the point that it reflects the currently ongoing weakening of the sun towards the big fall ice age ahead. At the current stage, the cooling of the Earth is not caused by a colder sun, but by a weaker sun that produces increased solar cosmic ray flux, which increases cloudiness. As I said before, the white top surface of the clouds reflects a portion of the inflowing solar energy back into space, which thereby becomes lost to us and makes the Earth colder. The stronger the cloudiness becomes, the colder the Earth gets. That's the process that gave us the little ice age in the 1600s under a weaker sun. The little ice age corresponds with extremely high volumes of solar cosmic ray flux, which are typical for a weaker sun. The sun was so weak during the little ice age that for a 30 years period no sunspots had occurred, and the cosmic ray flux was enormously large. The historic cosmic ray flux volume can be measured in carbon-14 ratios that stand as a proxy for the cosmic ray volumes, since carbon-14 is exclusively produced by the interaction of cosmic rays impacting with the atmosphere, whereby a small portion of the atmospheric nitrogen is transformed into carbon-14. By this process, the historic cosmic ray flux can be measured, and with it also the historic solar activity can be measured. These measurements tell us that the Sun recovered for 300 years after the Little Ice Age, which is evident in diminishing carbon-14 measurements. The recovered Sun would have given us less cloudiness and 300 years of global warming, which continued to grow stronger until roughly 1998. After 1998, the Sun began to weaken again. The Sun is presently in a free-fall type collapse mode towards the next ice age starting up in the 2050s, potentially. The entire recovery of the Sun, spanning 300 years, that got us out of the Little Ice Age in the 1600s, is now rapidly reversing itself. Half of it has already been lost in the last 15 years. The rest will be gone in the early 2030s. The free fall takes us down in 30 years, what the recovery had built up in over 300 years. The California drought and the more recent flooding in north-central California are all fringe effects of the now ongoing collapse in the solar system. The cooling of the Earth has already increased to the point that we see snowfall happening again in the northern Sahara Desert. The point is that the fringe effects are getting worse and will increase for the next 30 years, so that preparations need to be made for their occurrences. In many cases, the preparations will be of the same types that are required in preparation for the next ice age startup in the 2050s. It will become increasingly necessary in the coming years to shift critical elements of our agriculture into indoor facilities. And this not because we are already seeing ice age effects. We are still in the interglacial warm period, but the fringe effects that hint towards what is to come should cause us to become concerned. And the sooner we start with that, the less will be the catastrophic losses from not responding to the changing world. In preparation for the full ice age starting in the 2050s, most agriculture should be operating in indoor facilities by then, with most of them being placed afloat on the equatorial seas between the hurricane bands for the lack of suitable land in the tropics, together with floating cities to serve the floating agricultures. We will likely need to build 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each to enable the relocation of the populations out of the regions that become uninhabitable during glaciation conditions under a potentially 70% weaker sun. That's the option we have with which to assure our future. I am certain that we will realize this option, as impossible as this may seem today. We will do it because it is easy to do and fun to do. We have all the needed materials on hand, sitting unused on the ground, and likewise the energy resources. We also have the technology developed to build the necessary infrastructures. But will we do it? Yes, we will do it because we are human beings. Building great projects is the human thing to do. Humanity is a creator at heart, a builder, producer, adventurer into realms untrod. We are not couched potatoes at heart. We are pioneers at heart. We stand before a threshold today into the world that we can yet barely imagine. In other words, we haven't seen anything yet in terms of what can be accomplished. Infinity is our limit. Building floating cities for free are but small things on the new scale. And this is why I must stop at this point looking forward, because we haven't experienced anything yet of what the full potentials are of an infinite species that we, humanity, have developed ourselves to become. In this context, we have a need to acknowledge to ourselves what we have already accomplished on this path, because much has been accomplished. The Oroville Dam crisis in February 2017 doesn't deserve to be called a crisis. The Oroville water infrastructure functioned well within its design parameters. Its 770-foot dam did not fail. As the tallest dam in the USA and the tallest earth-filled dam in the world, till the Aswan High Dam on the Nile superseded it. Its reservoir is the second largest in California. For 49 years, since its completion in 1968, the dam provided flood protection, power, and a reliable source for fresh water. That's an achievement. The Oroville Dam is one of the key features of the California State Water Project, which provides supplemental water for 25 million Californians and irrigation water for an estimated 750,000 acres of farmland via 440 miles of aqueducts. None of this was affected by the February 2017 flooding event, which was the most severe in the dam's history. A portion of the dam's main spillway was damaged, probably due to poor inspections, and the emergency spillway that had never been active since the dam was built suffered some erosion at its base that should have been prevented by an upgrade that had been denied. A great catastrophe would likely have occurred by the Oroville flooding event if the dam infrastructure had never been built. The flooding was prevented. And, in addition, a lesson was learned. The lesson is that vast volumes of water are carried in the atmosphere, which the ionization of it can cause to be released in great volumes. This means that artificial ionization of the atmosphere across the catchment for the Colorado River could rescue the vast Colorado River system that is rapidly drying up. The river system could be restored to its design parameters by the simple recognition of the principle that had caused the Oroville flooding. The Colorado River could be technologically maintained by this principle. It would be surprising if this option wasn't implemented relatively soon. Roughly 40 million people depend on the Colorado River for their water, and 45 million acres of agricultural land for irrigation. When the river dries up, a real crisis begins of immense proportions. But there is no need for this to let this come to pass. There is no need to demolish the Glen Canyon Dam either for the lack of water in the system to prop up Lake Mead downstream. A part of the maintenance task for this system should be to include the provision of adequate supplies to operate the system at design capacity. This can be accomplished with relative ease. There is no shortage of water in the air. The water can be harnessed with technologically induced ionization. The technology already exists. The natural principle that produced the horrendous floodwaters that flooded the Oroville system in 2017 can be applied artificially in the form of technological cloud ionization that can coax enough water out of the vast stores of water in the atmosphere to meet the Colorado River system's rather modest needs. There is absolutely no need to jeopardize the water supply for 40 million people and for irrigation for 4.5 million acres of farmland by allowing the Colorado River system to dry up when this can be prevented. The catchment basin of the Colorado River is so vast that a few inches of technological rain per month would rapidly fill the system back up to capacity and keep it filled with enough spare capacity built in for expanding needs. The energy requirement for this to happen would amount to but a fraction of the energy production that is lost with the system drying up. Of course, if one waits long enough in today's fast-changing world with a rapidly weakening sun, the conditions will develop that the rapidly increasing solar cosmic ray flux, especially when a big coronal hole opens up in the direction of the Earth, will cause a major flash flood event that can fill the Colorado system back up in a couple of weeks. This won't likely happen next year or in a few years till the early 2020s. But why should one wait that long until the natural system changes enough to fill our need, when the principles are already understood that enable us to meet our needs by our own power, by simply applying the principles that we understand? Now there is a third lesson standing in the background that the Oroville flooding event is putting on the table for consideration. And this one is big. It is related to the now ongoing transition towards the next ice age. And it is also related to economics. The spillway damage in the example shown here will be repaired, and the upgrade for the emergency spillway will likely be installed. The cost may add up to $250 million. But what about the levees downstream on the Feather River? The Feather River levee systems for the outflow of the dam had been rebuilt in 2015 at a cost of $300 million. It had been designed to serve 200 years. The capacity of 170,000 cubic feet per second carried the flood volume that was released with significant room to spare. The maximum that the Oroville spillway can release is 150,000 cubic feet per second, and the turbines another 17,000 cubic feet per second. The actual release during the flood event didn't come anywhere close to the full capacity for the dam and the state levee system to handle. Only some of the non-state levees that hadn't been rebuilt had been significantly dangerously too near the point of overflowing. So it hadn't been the failure of the main spillway that hadn't been used for some time, but had driven the Oroville flooding to the point of disaster. The danger had been the weak link in the system. The levees that had been sufficient during the past and had not been upgraded. The dam's regulators were limited in their freedom to act by this bottleneck. This time they succeeded. Disaster was avoided, but what about next year? Our sun is presently in a rapidly weakening phase that started in 1998 and will continue for another 30 years from the present. Every single passing year under the fast weakening sun will produce rapidly increasing cosmic ray flux. The solar cosmic ray flux was 20% over normal in 2008, when the Ulysses mission ended. It is potentially double that by now in 2017. That's what the increase in flooding events testify to, and their increasing flood volume. The cosmic ray flux may soon be 50% over normal, if it isn't already. This means that we are far from the point where we can use historic data as a yardstick for the future. We live in a different world now than we did when the big dams for flood control were built. Most were built in the decades prior to the year 2000, when the sun was still ramping up. The facilities were designed in a period when all was well and the world wasn't changing rapidly. Historic yardsticks were valid then, for the time when the dams were built. But now that the sun is diminishing, and is diminishing 10 times faster than it had previously ramped up, we are now encountering instabilities that exceed historic experiences. For every year ahead, we are moving backwards 10 years in solar activity in comparison with the historic solar upramping of the last 300 years. We are in a fresh new territory here. The type of steep solar collapse that we now experience has never been seen before in comparable historic measurements. The last time the Earth had been in a comparable situation of an Ice Age startup phase happening had been 120,000 years ago. If we use the ice core measurements as a measure for the future, all the yardsticks of experienced history fall away. And that's where we are. We are in a transition period towards something that has never been experienced before, where only scientific measurements can aid us. We are in a new world in which our future can only be judged by the principles we have discovered and the dynamics of their expression that we are beginning to recognize, even while these are largely not recognized in the mainstream world to exist. The measurements that the NASA and ESO spacecraft brought home shouldn't be possible according to the widely accepted model for the Sun in the mainstream world of science. Consequently, the measurements that have been made, which challenge the old model, are swept under the rug instead of the model becoming updated into line with what the measured evidence tells us. The evidence tells us that we haven't seen anything yet. The California Central Valley is a natural flood bowl, as is the Mississippi Basin, the Ganges Basin, the Indus Basin, the Volga Basin, the Nile Basin, the Yangtze River Basin, the Congo Basin, the Amazon Basin, and so on. Evidence suggests that the famous biblical flood may have been a large solar-cast flash flood event across the large area of the three rivers catchment area, which all flow into the big flood bowl of Mesopotamia that is surrounded by mountains with just a narrow gap for an outflow. So far, we have seen only a 40% to 50% increase in cosmic ray flux over the last 20 years, according to the rate of increase measured by Ulysses. The rate of the increase may not be linear, but may be a geometric increase. We might be seeing a 300% larger cosmic ray flux over the next 30 years, with dramatically larger volleys of cosmic rays flowing through the increasingly larger coronal holes that will develop. As these dynamics unfold into ever larger flooding events, it will likely become an economic necessity in the not-so-distant future to venture into large-scale floating indoor agriculture. This takes us far beyond hydroponics, onto a scale that requires extremely large artificial infrastructures that basalt-based processes can easily provide, produced in large-scale, high-temperature, automated industrial facilities. Nothing less than a new industrial revolution of this type operating at a worldwide cooperative effort will be sufficient to create floating infrastructures. But it is all totally achievable. Basalt is a type of stone that melts at 1200 degrees Celsius. It is basically lava and exists in a number of extremely large surface deposits around the world in the form of flat basalt provinces. The Siberian Traps is one of the largest, in the range of 5 million cubic kilometers in volume. India also has a large deposit sitting unused on the ground, though smaller in volume. Basalt is stronger than steel by weight, is non-corrosive, is chemically inert, and is almost as hard as diamond. It has an extremely fine grain so that it can be extruded into microfibers. And best of all, this almost ideal building material lays process-ready on the ground in infinite abundance. All that is needed for it to be used is high-density energy to melt it. This the liquid fuel nuclear fission reactor can provide, or cosmic energy can provide. Both options are possible. The liquid-fueled nuclear power reactor has its nuclear fuel dissolved in molten salt, operating at normal air pressure. The molten salt reactor can utilize thorium as fuel, or uranium or plutonium. Very high temperature reactors are possible on these bases that are able to operate at temperatures above 1400 degrees Celsius. This brings them well within the range for melting basalt. The world supply of this primary fuel, thorium, is immense, and so is the energy it can produce. The molten salt thorium reactor will be the primary power source for the basalt shaping industrial processes. The thorium reactor has been developed and has been kept unused on the shelf since the 1950s because, as the former director of the CERN laboratory suggests, its byproducts are useless for building nuclear bombs. A still greater energy resource is cosmic electric energy, for which the utilization of technology has not yet been developed. The Earth is surrounded in space by a soup of plasma, the same plasma that powers the Sun, except in a less dense form. The ionosphere is our interface for it. The protons for the plasma soup are attracted to the Earth and settle onto the ground, while the electrons become stripped in the atmosphere to form the ionosphere. NASA discovered two large, dense electrojets encircling the Earth. Should we develop the technology to tap into these streams, we would have a very large energy resource available that is self-renewing from the cosmic sources forever and ever. Here lies our energy future. This energy resource has not yet been made accessible, probably for reasons that it would obsolete oil as an energy resource, and is therefore blocked for obvious reasons. We will need to bring this new type of energy resource online on a sufficiently large scale to power the additional artificial sunlight that may be required for the upcoming floating indoor agricultures and for homes and industries and for transportation. The floating agriculture will happen, and probably quite soon, because, as I said before, the consequences are on its side. The economic incentive for floating agriculture is so large that the entire process will drive itself by the power of its economics. And so, the Ice Age economic development will also happen by its underlying economic necessity for much smaller reasons than the Ice Age challenge itself, and also for powering food production more efficiently. The flooding out of the traditional food production infrastructures will force the world into Ice Age economics. In comparison with having to deal with the ever-increasing flooding that looms in the near future, and their destructive consequences and crop losses, as the coronal holes are getting bigger and the flooding larger, and the protection against them is becoming ever more expensive, the building of a new world with agriculture afloat on the oceans will soon become an attractive option for the lack of a better alternative. The bottom line, again, is we haven't seen anything yet. The coronal holes for the Oroville flooding event was relatively small in comparison with what lies before us. Significantly larger coronal holes are possible, even at the equator of the Sun, where they are presently still rare. And even when these larger events are beginning to happen, we still haven't seen anything yet. We still have another 30 years before us of this dreadful trend getting worse, which results in ever larger flooding events with ever larger costs involved. California's water infrastructure is a gigantic complex system that promises to become increasingly costly to maintain, so much so that it may become economically advantageous at a point to simply put the critical agriculture afloat onto the sea in large-scale automated indoors facility, and this long before it becomes an existentially critical necessity to do so. Floating agricultural modules offer many advantages. No flood control will be needed, and freshwater supplies and volumes of CO2 for increased plant growth are all available right where they are needed, fed from the oceans. In addition, floating self-contained agricultural modules that operate with scientifically controlled environments can themselves be produced extremely efficiently with automated industrial production methods and be produced out of basalt. Fresh water can be drawn from the ocean by a process of deep ocean reverse osmosis desalination. On land, desalination plants use high pressure to force salt water through a membrane that blocks the salt modules and lets the fresh water pass. The energy cost is high for producing fresh water with high-pressure desalination. But if the membrane is placed 5,000 meters deep, the weight differential between salt water and fresh water will produce enough pressure differential for the process to run by itself. The needed volumes of CO2 for CO2-enriched greenhouse operations can likewise be drawn from the sea that contains 50 times as much CO2 dissolved in it than the atmosphere holds. When CO2 becomes a gas again at lower pressures near the surface, it expands and makes the upwelling column lighter, whereby the extraction process drives itself. Hydroponics is already commercially utilized to grow food right in the cities, in old warehouses, with artificial lighting tuned to the plant's needs and with climate control. This process requires no soil and uses 95% less water. Nor does it require pesticides, but requires substantial energy for lighting, possibly in the order of 20 watts per square meter. By the process of growing food without soil, however, the roots are nourished with a fine spray of water. By this process, certain disadvantages arise. Plants growing in soil are supported by soil bacteria that break down numerous minerals in the soil into specific forms that the plants can absorb. Without this process, plants tend to become nutritionally hollow. High-tech greenhouse operations would likely utilize plants growing in soil, exposed to sunlight, with double or triple the current CO2 density in the air and potentially enhanced with artificial sunlight during the dark hours. A lot of research will yet have to be conducted in order to explore the most efficient lighting, nourishment, and atmosphere to maximize plant growth. When all this is optimized, a 10 to 12-fold increased production yield might be achievable, with potentially 6 harvests per year. Yes, we will build 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each and place many of them afloat onto the oceans to service the new agriculture there, with the whole linked by floating bridges between the continents. And all of this too will be in place in 30 years, driven by its own economics. Who would want to live in a flat bowl, operating fields that become frequently flooded out and often frozen over? Who would choose this precarious type of living when it can be easily avoided? We live in an ice age world already, in many respects, and we'll make the best of it, and most likely do it better than we had done before. The bottleneck of the Oroville flood crisis was evidently not the dam site, since its discharge capacity had been underutilized. Nor was the state levee system stressed to its limit, which had been upgraded in 2015. The bottleneck appears to have been the non-state levees that had been filled to the brim. The Oroville crisis may have been a tightrope walk of balancing the capacity of the old infrastructure that used to be sufficient in the past, with the new world of a weaker sun and larger floods. The crisis was solved by filling the 9 upstream reservoirs to the brim and draining the lake as strongly as the weakest levees would allow, and the storms also easing off. The point is that while we have created amazing infrastructures and management systems, the very best is evidently no longer good enough to meet the demands for the future. This requires a major rethinking of the entire issue of flood protection and agriculture in flood bowl locations, which requires the rethinking of agriculture itself. This means that we are existentially threatened by the Ice Age dynamics before the Ice Age even begins. And this affects nearly all nations, especially the big food production nations, such as the USA. The California Central Valley is a natural flood bowl. If our best efforts are already stressed to the limits, what will the future bring in 30 years of the sun getting weaker? The Mississippi River Basin, too, is a gigantic natural flood bowl, 2.9 million square kilometers in size. Can anyone imagine the consequences when the continuing weakening of the sun, with the resulting increase in cosmic ray flux over the next 30 years, causes flooding of epic proportions? The entire area from St. Louis to New Orleans may become a lake within a couple of weeks of heavy flooding of the gigantic catchment basin. The contemplation of this potential of biblical proportions may cause society to fundamentally rethink the location of agriculture and the location of its cities. Floating agriculture and floating cities may offer an attractive alternative in the not-so-distant future. In fact, should the potential be considered right now, it would start some major efforts in the next few years to develop alternatives that we can live with. Mesopotamia, the biblical flood bowl, had a similar flooding potential as the Mississippi Basin has. The two major rivers flowing through Mesopotamia, the Euphrates and the Tigris, drain large areas of the Middle East into a low-elevation, narrow bowl surrounded by mountains that has only a single outflow through a narrow, low-elevation gap. Large volumes of solar reflux by a large solar event, potentially 8,000 years ago, may have caused an extensive flash flood event in this region at this time, drowning much of it beneath a shallow flood lake that may have taken weeks to drain away into the Persian Gulf. Something big happened 8,200 years ago that had interrupted the up-ramping of the sun for a brief period of possibly a couple centuries. The interference may have been similar in nature, only very much larger and longer extended than what appears to have intruded into the main of the sun in 2014, captured by the SOHO satellite. The biblical story of a large flood event may have developed from this background, expanding as a tale told at firesides by a people searching for the roots of their existence for millennia, till written languages were created. The same flash flood potential also exists for the Indus River Basin and for the gigantic Ganges River Basin that drains almost all of northern India into the Bay of Bengal. Large areas of the vast Ganges River Basin, all the way from Delhi to Kolkata, have the potential to become a flood lake in the not-so-distant future during major cosmic ray events as the sun is diminishing further and further towards its near phase shift to the lower energy state, when the primal fields collapse that presently keep the sun in its high-powered state. The super flooding events may be upon us in the 2040s, and may be of a magnitude that has never been seen before in all of recorded history, which is relatively brief in cosmic terms. South America has the same flooding potential in the low elevation regions of its three major river systems, especially that of the Amazon system that drains 7 million square kilometers of land. Africa has likewise enormous flooding potential in the Congo River Basin and along the Nile, as these gigantic rivers drain much of equatorial Africa. The drive for economic survival will likely power the move to place ever more of the world's agriculture onto the sea, together with the endangered cities, for no other reason than to eliminate the need for flood control measures that may not be physically possible in many cases, and to have dependable fresh water supplies available for them where drought conditions are increasing at the same time. This will likely drive the redevelopment of the world onto the sea, and this well before the next ice age actually begins. The ice age is essentially too far off the scale of historic experiences to compel the redevelopment of the world for its imperatives, but a potential for epic floods to happen sooner, in ever more cases, in biblical proportions, and on a continental scale that endangers the world food supply, may have that potential to get the ball rolling for the needed transformation of the world that must be largely completed before the next ice age begins in the 2050s. For this to work, the old imperial monetarist system will need to be scrapped and be replaced with some type of non-monetarist credit system that enables society to invest its creative and productive efforts as an investment into itself, which thereby gains its value. Ironically, the Ice Age challenge comes with a silver lining attached that will be our salvation. When the challenge is recognized and responded to, it will force humanity to scrap its doomsday machines that its nuclear war capability has become. It will force humanity to work together to solve the onrushing crisis that no nation, no matter how strong, can solve alone. The Ice Age challenge forces us to work together as one people, or no one can survive. On this path, the nuclear war machine will be laid aside. Nothing has apparently worked to accomplish this for 70 years, since the madness began. For 70 years, humanity has lived under this absolute terror threat of its own creation, which none of the participating nations had the courage to stop. The Ice Age challenge that now looms on the horizon may give us this courage, whereby we may live to see the new era unfolding. We appear to be extremely fortunate that we are still alive today, considering the millions of things that can go wrong on the nuclear war front, which, once they happen, promise to end in the total annihilation of us all. Nuclear war is an extremely dangerous gamble, with the living of humanity as a whole hanging on a fine thread that is fast getting thinner. A great danger exists on this front that the USA may be coerced by political power plays to restart the nuclear arms race again in an insane quest to build itself the biggest nuclear arms stick in the world, which it once had. The nuclear war terror poses such an immense threat against human living that I had explored the dynamics of this danger in a novel that I had written during the height of the Cold War years, when we had 65,000 nuclear bombs hanging over our head by our own doing. I had hoped against hope that time would dissolve the madness. But time itself doesn't solve anything. Something deeper is evidently needed that reaches deep into our very soul and raises us up as human beings by the force of our humanity, to the point that we will lay aside the bombs and war. This hasn't happened yet, but the Ice Age challenge may get us there. As it does, it opens up a portal to a future that outshines everything that we have ever achieved in the past. The Ice Age challenge is of a magnitude that dissolves all borders, all divisions, all beliefs, and ushers in an era of truth, where the petty, small-minded notions of the past are left behind and be forgotten, that presently render humanity an enemy against itself. The near Ice Age startup, with its increasing drought conditions and potential flooding events leading up to it, are so immense and so far beyond our historic experiences that for the first time in human history, we may feel impelled to raise ourselves up to meet the challenge that seems greater than us, and become more fully human and divine as the tallest species of life on the earth, with a potential future that promises to be brighter than the sun itself, which we have the power to create, and most likely will create. Herein will we find the greatest value of the Ice Age challenge, which is a challenge to not merely seek survival by whatever means possible, but to find our survival in the advanced development of our humanity and its power and beauty and dignity, even while without these we cannot survive. Our humanity is precious. It is the most precious gem on the earth, the noblest creation of God, the tallest expression of life that ever came to be on this earth, second to none by a long shot. I would like to suggest that if we develop our humanity and let it be the driving force on a platform of universal love, we cannot fail to win our freedom to live richly, productively, with fulfilling aspirations, and with this song on the mind, fulfill the Ice Age challenge without effort along the way. Universal love is a power that dissolves the barriers that stand in our way, as difficult as these may seem. In this context, freedom can no longer be defined as an unrestrained pursuit of will, but is defined by gaining the power to step beyond invalid barriers, such as the barriers against the good we have the potential to create, to nourish, and to experience in ever larger universal forms of expression. After my novel, Brighter Than the Sun, I wrote the novel Discovering Love, which became the seed kernel for a series of 12 novels, carrying forward the exploration of the principle of universal love. It was a daring, pioneering venture into an uncharted world of a principle that was poorly understood and even denied and rejected, just as the Ice Age challenge is presently poorly understood and is denied and rejected. I would like to suggest that the Ice Age challenge, for the immense scope of it, will ultimately not be met as a climate issue or technical issue or even an economic issue, even while the economics for meeting the challenge are largely on its side. I would like to suggest that the Ice Age challenge cannot be met on any lesser basis than the uplifted dignity of man, universally, in love unrestrained, reaching beyond divisions, overcoming isolation, uplifting sex, ennobling the race of humanity, blocking greed, reversing hate with truth, and banishing indifference with the honesty of universal love that is already in the human heart. I would like to suggest that on the platform of universal love, a momentous phase shift can be achieved that uplifts the world, as unlikely as this may seem in the vastly divided modern world where spiritual issues are deemed to have no value, such as truth and honesty, including honesty with oneself. I would like to suggest that a phase shift can be achieved towards us gaining our freedom from the world-imprisoning trap that has entangled our motives and aspirations with a multitude of small-minded issues that keep us locked into a confining box where little is real and powerful for elevating civilization. I would like to suggest that there is a love possible that lifts the barriers from the heart, patiently, a love that is silently waiting, reaching for the sky, a love for one another that ushers in the coming human spring where mankind is afloat in a sea that is love. I would like to suggest further that on this path our meeting of the Great Ice Age Challenge becomes a non-event. that it becomes as natural in the flow of this love as the rain in a parched land, and as fun as splashing through the puddles in spring. For this reason, I have named the series of novels that explores the dynamics of universal love in honor of its native place in the heart, the lodging for the rose. I would like to suggest that when we begin to celebrate the wonders of our common humanity, the Ice Age challenge will be met more rapidly and completely in the flow of it than we can yet imagine to be possible, and will be met with joy in the greatest renaissance of all times that we will then experience.